Beneath the ground, unseen streams flow. After rain you can hear them. Waters rising through the sands and gravels to the south run down and unite hereabouts. The knowledge of this fact creates a sense of depth, of dimension. Are these natural features now engineered into the city's frame, the hermetic tail end of what was formerly common knowledge, a residue from better times now known only to the elect? I always walked a lot. As a child, growing up in Finchley, in the county of Middlesex, walking was the way I got to know my world.
Well, I've known Nick Papadimitriou, I would say, for about 23 years, so since the mid-1980s. And you meet a lot of people over the years, but I think he always had a kind of ready brick penumbra of originality and otherness.
He's like a ludicrously pragmatic mystic, like some sort of dull, trudging, train-spotting alchemist.
I met him first at St Luke's, Old Street, this chapel, which was a Hawksmoor obelisk, and which meant a lot to me. And I was doing a conversation there, kind of public conversation with Will Self, and Nick inserted himself somewhere in Will Self's slipstream and came up to me and said that he was doing interesting research for Will and he was happy to do it for me.
I did 3 walks round Brentford studying the topography, history, etc. Did quite a lot of reading on the area. Hampstead, inevitably. Extensive close walks, 20 plus on the Heath, and study of the history of the area, partly for Book of Dave. Highgate, I did do 2 close study walks and extensive reading, that was also for Book of Dave. Edmonton I walked around, I studied the drainage systems down there. As you know, it's the terminus of the East Middlesex main drainage scheme at Deepham's Farm.
Hey! Exactly.
Book of Dave contours.
It is the Book of Dave contours that show what's left of England when after a 100-metre rise. Nick helped me a great deal with my research for the Book of Dave because of his kind of, I mean, interestingly, because he's a trained scientist as well, because he has this knowledge of ecology and ecological science. We did that together very, very shortly after he'd cleaned up from drugs, so it was a kind of, it was a very kind of moving thing that we did together. It was rather beautiful that we created this place. It was like a newfound land for both of us.
He seems very mundane and ordinary in lots of ways, but he sort of obviously sees magic in everything and sort of hoovers up magic out of, like, sort of, you know, stone and brick and concrete.
Do you think they know I'm here? Do you think in some way the sewage farm knows I'm here?
How could it?
You know, somewhere deep in the psyche, in the bricky psyche of the fabric of the building, something's kind of moving and oscillating slightly in excitement. Somebody understands us.
He is an eccentric. There's no doubt about it.
I always think when you arrive at places like Mogden that somehow you should pass through some portal or cross over some event horizon and you fuse with the landscape and become it in some kind of way.
There was this mysterious figure who was obviously deeply knowledgeable and deeply moved about the city. And I liked what I heard about his methods. And then shortly afterwards I was putting together an enormous assembly called London City of Disappearances. And I thought he should be included in it. And he sent me a couple of large pieces and a series of smaller pieces. And I would have really liked to use them all, but by this time the book was enormous. And I ended up just using one large piece, which was about the Heathrow territory. And I thought it exhibited a really interesting consciousness. I mean, a good writer, but a person who was able to drop you straight into that experience of walking and to wear his knowledge lightly and to construct a drama.
His writing so dense, incredible, sort of inaccessible texts that he writes. It's sort of like, my God, what does all this mean? It means, I know this means something. I don't understand it, but that's not his fault.
On walks you draw in the stored energy of places and transduct it into the field of words, these words, or rough maps, compressing the region's mind into folds of language, yellowed papers, storing these in bottle banks, racks of Kilner jars in the back gardens of fine weathered Edwardian houses. Be aware of what the Urban District Council manhole covers tell you. Sequences of streets must be learned by heart, a palimpsest memory of changes made available for recall. Up to about 3 years ago, the front of Clare Court was marked by pre-moulded 1950s palings, but these were replaced about the time they widened the bypass. A family of rats were driven into back gardens from the road's edge as a consequence. The land alongside La Deliverance swarms with mice on summer evenings. There are no predators because the island is surrounded by traffic. Wait till the Lotka-Volterra dynamic bites.
Because like I'm obsessed with comedy and characters, he was like such a find. Well, who's this in the AA meeting? So he would talk about like sort of living in his tower block and bits of and having difficulties with kids that would throw stones at him, and who know he sort of talks in this very sort of he holds his mouth in a peculiar way. Well, you know, Russell, it's well, what's the point? This sort of jittery high frequency within him. Yeah, well, I do get despondent sometimes. I got all curious about Nick and thought, right, I wanted to know more about him. Unconsciously, I was nicking aspects of his character for comedic purposes, because he is so delightfully amusing.
I was saying the Grateful Dead played here.
Oh wow.
They started in 1968, they're just finishing now. They're doing one of their encores.
Difficulty with Nick as a character, I mean, all writers are predatory. So every single person you meet is being auditioned as a character. And clearly Nick was so obviously a character, in inverted commas, that I would have stayed clear of using him as a character. And also I felt he probably belonged in the ambience of what Will Self was doing, and that maybe in some way he was a kind of Will Self character who had moved across to the east of London into territory that was familiar to me. So I would never have considered him a character. I just thought this is an interesting person, and I felt drawn towards him mostly as a writer. I could imagine him out there traversing his own part of London, and I don't know what he does, but my impression was he gathered an archive. He literally physically gathered up bits of the city, created an archive, had a library, and made himself available to other people to reveal the fruits of his research.
This is where we found those books that time. Do you remember? You found that map of New York, and I found that notebook and those letters from that man to his wife telling her that she shouldn't abuse his family name. There's some stuff on my website about that. That's quite interesting.
Do you find a lot of stuff, Nick, when you're walking?
Oh yeah. I found a Nicholas Pevsner brown penguin architecture of Middlesex in a skip in Southgate on one of my long walks. I took it as a sign from the gods that I was on the right track. And yeah, I found my first ever notebook I found at Goramsbury to the north of St Albans on a 3-day walk, just lying in the road. And I started writing my notebooks. That's really how I started writing. It was something I found on one of my walks.
I think I've always slightly been guilty of using Nick, but I don't feel like guilty about it, as a sort of inspiration. Not as an amanuensis, interestingly, because his project is different from mine. But, you know, I'm a much less eccentric in some ways and more mainstream figure. And I just find him very, very interesting to kind of hit off and to spark off and to riff off. I like the idea of reverse commuting, obviously. The idea I was living in Shepherd's Bush, that I'd get in the car every morning and drive against the flow of traffic and write experimental fiction in a light industrial estate instead of... But that was still, I mean, that would have been in the No, that would have been in the late 80s, so it was still off the back of the kind of interzonal preoccupation.
Was that after you had the place at Dollis Hill?
Yeah, no. Yes. The Dollis Hill place was a bit like that as well. But I was stuck back into crack. I used to go and sit on Horsenden Hill and sort of smoke 60 quid's worth of crack and then have a mental breakdown. I never actually got anything done in the light industrial premises at all. The Observer came out and filmed a room of my own there, or shot a photo of me and interviewed me there, and it was a complete farce because it was a room that I never actually went to. I was always setting off from home intending to go there, but I was so fucked up. I just sort of go and score drugs.
I know the syndrome. I know, and once you start, you just can't stop for that day, and then you tell yourself the next day, I'm going to start. I had that with marijuana.
Well, I had it with all of them. They were all indistinguishable, but crack was just a sort of particularly savage version of that. That was when I was getting stuck into crack in the very late 80s, early 90s.
Drugs become samey as it progresses, doesn't it? When you're sort of young, it's like, oh, I'm taking speed, oh, I'm drinking alcohol, oh, I'm having dope. And then in the end you just blend them all so much that it just becomes a kind of gungy, sort of grey intoxication with some variants maybe within it, but they're all pretty much the same in the end.
It's because you're using one to palliate the effects of another. You're not using them recreationally. You're using them as this kind of marmite of sensation that you spread all over the place.
Well, I like Nick's term deep topography very much. I mean, so much so that I've stolen it straight away as a way of avoiding this term psychogeography, because psychogeography was becoming a rather nasty brand name. I felt some guilt for having brought this about. It had an authentic status in the 1960s when it was connected to situationism and to a way of aggressively dealing with the city. And then it drifted off into a kind of no man's land until I thought Stuart Home rescued it with his London Psychogeographical Association, in which the thing was activated again into present concerns and had a kind of comedy aspect to it as well. And then it really got into the popular mind as a way of describing almost anything to do with cities. Any activity or anything to do with walking became psychogeography. And Nick clearly challenged this terminology and brought in deep topography, which makes it seem more like that very British tradition of the naturalist, the walker at the edges of the city, the liminal figure who does all of that and who is not so conceptual in his practice. And I thought this is therefore a very, very useful term, and I'd like to use it myself. I have signed up to deep topography and abdicated from psychogeography immediately on hearing this term.
It's about getting a very, very dangerous balance between finding the overlooked and showing it to the other people who have an eye for the overlooked, and not making the overlooked into something that is gazed at. You know, like people looking through the bars of a monkey house or something, or some baboon plays with his penis or picks his arse. You know, which is probably a pretty good description of what me and Sinclair do anyway.
My understanding of psychogeography is quite limited. You've got your own personal psychogeography. Very recently I went back to the place where I'm from, Grays in Essex, and walked around, and the person I was with, again, John, is that it's amazing how your memories come alive when you encounter a place you've not been for a long while. We saw a wall outside an ambulance station off of Hog Lane where I used to live, very low wall with sort of a low brick wall with a sort of concrete slab laid across the top of the brick wall. And I sort of, as I saw it, I remembered walking along that wall but holding hands with someone, because I would have been a child. I'd have been like 3 years old, and it was as if, as John said, the memories had been left there. As if they physically were the memory. Oh, look, there's that memory. As if it were an object rather than something that had been carried in my mind. So it's quite kind of interested in a Jungian sense, as if we have access, as if there is a common consciousness or unconsciousness or super-consciousness around that we can access, and that there's somehow a relationship between that and the physical world and topography and geography.
You talk to him and you talk round it, you soon realise that there's a hell of a lot more going on here than is summed up by the sort of hoary, now kind of hoary old term psychogeography, or, you know, he's not merely a flaneur, he's not merely nor is he trying, you know, as perhaps some of us are, to you know, kind of second guess or escape from the kind of machine-man matrix that dominates perception of place, nor is he, he's not really reactionary, you know, though he's interested a lot in the past. He's not really just simply a conservative with a small c who kind of doesn't like the way things have developed. He's not simply a local historian either. He's sort of all of these things and something else. They are more than the sum of their parts.
John? So now here we are to the north of the course of the river, and if you look over here, you can really see the shape of a substantial gully forming. And in fact, we're looking across a mini river valley towards the far side. When I first saw that, or first noticed it, I should say, a couple of years ago, I was absolutely astonished. I felt as if I was time travelling. I felt I was looking back into, you know, the pre-World War I era. I could suddenly see the rural, if you like, shape of the land. Something that's just screened out by modern sensibility. It's a very powerful experience. It's kind of portal or window through to other possibilities that are embedded in the landscape. I've spent my whole life walking around these types of places. I feel like I'm looking for somebody. Look at that piece of metal. It could be a church bell. It should ring out every Sunday. Come and pray at this pile of turds, because this is you. The bit that we deny in ourselves. You know, all these people go into therapy, try and engage with their other side. This is the other side. This is what we don't want to look at. This is the thing we're embarrassed about. We open the windows, we spray. Don't smell my shit. You may not like me anymore. These guys, they were prepared to look at it. This is the end result of years of therapy. Mogden purification works. Okay, I want to rest for a minute.
The sort of places that Nick, I mean, likes is too weak a word, that he reveres. You know, they do have a kind of common feel to them. They are places, broadly speaking, that are kind of feel left behind by the passage of history. They're the kind of oxbow lakes of urbanity that are kind of left there in some way. Because he often, you'll be with Nick, and you've probably had this experience, and he'll start to wax lyrical over a manhole cover or a concrete stanchion with a single, you know, kind of pre-stressed steel you know, girder kind of protruding out of the top of it, that sort of thing, you know. So that is a kind of synecdoche for all of Nick world, and then you'll see larger examples of it, whether it's the Mogden purification works or some section of the Grand Union Canal.
It's the hub of the landscape, isn't it? Everything heads here. Everything flows down this way and terminates at that 1930s municipal building over there, built by the Middlesex County Council. The opening was attended by Sir Montague Sharp, founder of the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, who believed that there were straight lines, an architectonic based on the old Roman pagae boundaries, embedded in the landscape. And here he was attending the opening of another systematic breaking up of the landscape in the name of municipality.
Plus, I suppose there's nothing, you know, sort of if you read, I don't know, like sort of Wordsworth or like, you know, the paintings of Turner, we can all see there's magic in sort of the ocean or in the sort of the Great British countryside, but it takes an interesting mind to look at, like, sort of say, oh, I saw this power station in Middlesex, and like, thinks it's Kubla Khan.
The appeal of the edgeland is it's unofficial, it's between permitted territories, and it's a diminishing resource. And I think a lot of the writing that I've seen of Nick's is to do with the mutated wildlife of these areas. He's fascinated when he finds some particular plant or animal or new species or birds that are still there and surviving, and the excitement when he breaks into a property that's semi-protected seems to be exactly where his practice needs to be, and I completely sympathise with that.
I can imagine this place looking pretty much the same in 1976 and 1965, even though that building's obviously a bit more recent than that. Seems to be like still points in the turning world. I'd much rather be here than Camden High Street, that's for sure. I'll thrive in places like this. When I was very sad a few years ago, I came out to places like this, and they seemed to be steeped in their own kind of time system, and it was different to the time system I found in the cafes of Camden and Hampstead. It was completely overlooked, full of sycamore and giant hogweed and bittersweet woody nightshade growing over there.
And in the 80s I was very interested in interzones, what I called interzones after the Burroughsian term. I was really very interested, and Nick was as well, in liminal places, places that existed, you know, particularly the border between the urban and the rural, or Rus in Urb, or Urb in Rus, you know, those kind, you know, sort of, so in a way those three states are all aspects of each other. Back in the 80s I remember walking within places like Erith Marsh, now gone sadly. I mean now somewhat ironically in terms of Nick's history, where they put Belmarsh Prison, but at that time perhaps the last redoubt of kind of serious Rus in Urb that was that far into inner London.
This photograph was taken at Erith Marshes in 1988. Will was working on a project called Interzone. I've seen the files in his large archive at his place in Stockwell. Quite interesting and for that time groundbreaking stuff.
What was it about?
Sort of like the kind of margins of London, the interactive zone between the man-made and nature. Very good man. I rise and look more closely at where I have been sitting. It is one of those concrete slabs topping some reservoir or inverted siphon, a portal through to the hidden worlds. A splash of sunlight smears across the red roofs of Kingsbury, and a rush of wind rattles the briars down by the footpath. Once more the landscape unlocks. I zone in on new joys. Look at that picket fence and the vegetation growing in the arch over. It's like such another world, isn't it?
It is, it's very nice.
That could be Russia or something, Ukraine.
You know, he's got an incredible language at his disposal, and then went like and remarkable ideas and an incredible past. Like he's an arsonist, you know. Like it's not often you'll meet an arsonist. Oh, there's somebody at the door. It's not often you'll meet an arsonist, and when you do, you think, well, what is that? Why would you want to set fire to things? What's that an expression of? Particularly such a, you know, sort of like, you know, imagine like, you know, if you like someone goes to you, you're going to meet an arsonist later, and then you meet some sort of Alan Bennett type character comes wandering in. Well, yes, well, there was a fire within me, so I just expressed that fire without. I'd like to see the inferno, fuego, the Spanish would call it. Yeah, he's got this E.L. Whisty thing about him as well. He's got some Peter Cook like sort of lucid confusion. There's so many peculiar opposing ideas present in him.
And I think a lot of it, you know, is I see him as somebody who had quite a traumatic upbringing and who found in place a kind of nurture that he didn't find elsewhere.
I felt as if I'd claimed something for myself that was away from the world that I felt had rejected me. You know, a lot of it was probably just stuff in my head. It wasn't anything coherent that was happening in the outside world, but within the context of my psychology and how I was seeing the world at the time, it was really important for me to come to places like this. I felt as if I was gaining power over something that had been... I felt as if I'd been roughly handled by something that was bigger and more powerful than me, and by coming here I was aligning myself with something that was prior to and larger than the thing that had rejected me, as if I'd found a more powerful ally in my struggle.
What's the relevance to you, Nick?
When I was 17, I was brought to Ashford Remand Centre on an arson charge, set fire to my school twice. They drove me out here. I was remanded at Highgate, then they drove me down to the holding centre at Lambeth and put us all on different wagons. Some of us went to the Scrubs, some of us went to Ashford, wherever. They brought me here. I couldn't believe it. I just felt so far away from home. And yet I was enthralled by the landscape. I was really struck by how flat it was. I remember noticing that at the time. It was rough in there. My mum died while I was in there. I knew she was dead a month before they told me. And I went up, I just knew by instinct. I went up to Highgate Court on the 29th of December 1975. Got another 3 weeks remand. They told me that my mum was dead. So it wasn't the happiest of times. So I ended up in Wormwood Scrubs in 1976, March. I was sent down from the Middlesex Crown Court, held at the Middlesex Guildhall near Westminster.
Did you ever go back there as an adult, Nick?
Yeah, in 1983 I was in there with Dennis Nilsen, the serial killer. He was in the cell next to me. He gave me... I remember I was on this drug that used to knock me out every lunchtime, and about 3 days after he arrived I dozed off on my cell bed. It was during association, so all the cell doors were opened, and when I opened my eyes, Nilsen was standing in my doorway looking at me. He wrote a poem about me called Silver Boy. He said the silver boy lies on his bed as if he's dead. I reckon it crossed his mind to strangle me. It would have been a real coup in the media. You know, he's just been sent down for killing people and he's killed someone within days of getting his life sentence.
You're mate, you're alright.
So
What was
this
the
is
inside for then?
setting fire to my school.
Oh yeah, a bit of a naughty one.
Well, you know.
You don't look naughty now, you look. You don't look like the fella like to do that.
No, I wouldn't do that. I was quite a nice lad actually.
Yeah. Just your temper, I say, was it?
Yeah, they wouldn't let me do
Couldn't control it.
A-levels.
No.
Ease of passage across the city is ever more denied, so that the walker becomes somebody like a gorilla. He has to duck and dive even to negotiate a passage across the city. And so obviously a renegade figure like Nick would need at the edge of the city to walk. It would be the only way, and he'd have to keep walking to get to somewhere where he's allowed to walk, and then walk becomes a form of practice, becomes a form of breathing and memory, touching the ground. It's the way that narrative presents itself. I don't think any other form engenders narrative in quite the same way. If you're in a car, you're in a pod, you're in a kind of dream, you're sealed off, it's a reverie. If you're on a bicycle, you've got to be so conscious of the traffic surrounding you just to survive that there's no time to get into this kind of stream of natural consciousness, which is walking. And therefore walking becomes the most natural form for lifting your consciousness. And I think all of the real spirits of the city are doing it all the time.
That's our real wilderness. But I know when I walk, I seem to access all sorts of levels of processes taking place under hedges, or the memories of people who I've never known, they're memories that aren't mine, and yet they seem so tangible. Everywhere there's this sense of loss.
This last walk we did, he did quite a big chunk of with me. I think we met up at on the far end of White City, I think, and he walked with me out to Uxbridge, which is a fair old pull. I was on my way via Pinewood Studios to Heathrow and then on to LA, where I spent a week without setting foot in any wheeled transport at all, circumambulating the entire Los Angeles basin. And Nick took the train back to Golders Green.
You know, there isn't much of a narrative here for me. We're creating a new one.
Or perhaps you're going to pick up on other people's narratives.
I hope so.
That are sort of bound into the landscape in some sort of way.
And my project has sort of become much more linear. I mean, I always sort of think that Nick must view me as really still quite enthralled to exactly the things that he's quite free of. I mean, my walks, this series of airport walks that I've been doing really over the last, well, now over about 5 or 6 years, though they kind of embrace that idea of the liminal, they're still, you know, what intrigues me, of course, is that nobody has, or very few people in contemporary society have a kind of continuous physical knowledge of moving from the urban to the rural, that, you know, everybody leaps over that, whether it's by car or, you know, by some sort of public transport.
It's interesting what Will Self said when he went on my now defunct radio show, was that he said that, you know, the reason he'd walked from London to Heathrow and then from LAX to the city of Los Angeles was because probably no one else would ever have done that. Like, you know, sort of like that, you know, everywhere's been explored and everyone is bored of the Antarctica and you can climb Everest on a work jaunt, you know, and like, but like probably no one has ever walked from LAX to LA City, or certainly not lately. And like, but still was really remarkably interesting, because I wonder what that space must feel like when you sort of experience it in meticulous detail, step by step, because it just passes in a blur, of course, in a car, and that's sort of, I suppose, the point that Will and Nick must have been examining, is that yeah, if you have a relationship with those unspaces, those spaces that are just neutral, you don't really deal with it, like you know, and airports themselves are just designed to not have any impact on you, and then the journey through those industrial flat places, like it's nothing there, is there? You don't sort of think, and then there was this gorge and then a valley and there's some bats flew out. It's just, again, it's like they all look the same, don't they, all of those places.
I'm touched by your thoughts in that respect, but a lot of people's conceptions of their place and their way of being in the urban environment always strike me as incredibly primitive. I mean, they do live in a Edwardian society of spectacle, even if it's more defined by their own emotivism, by their relationship with family than it is by work and commerce. They still have, I mean, all of those sort of, you know, massed phalanxes of, you know, men and women in West London in kind of sleeveless anoraks and Laura Ashley headscarves, beating up and down in great massed formations, you know, of Land Rover Vogues to Wiltshire. I mean, they don't live in a London that, you know, is defined by that kind of thinking, or very few of them do, you know, setting aside the rather crude class stereotypy. They're not, you know, I just don't, I talk to people the whole time, and, you know, they're, I mean, I hate to sound like a fucking grump about it, but their incomprehension of exercises like this make me understand that they don't actually inhabit the city in the way that you or I do at all.
And how does that leave you feeling, Will?
I don't really give a shit.
Because the way that we've organised our civilization is that you're so detached and removed from the land that everything's been lacquered in concrete and you're protected from it, and you can't have an organic, visceral experience with your land, with the place that you're from.
My ambition is to hold my region in my mind, so that I am the region, so that when I die I literally do become Middlesex in some kind of way. I mean, for me, that is my highest spiritual aspiration. You know, I will be the tarmac you race along the A41T. I'll be absorbed into the mildewed lintels, hidden in overgrown knotweed by the side of the Hendon Way. I will be the beetles scurrying under a piece of corrugated plastic, hidden in some piss-stained corner of Moat Mount Nature Reserve. It's good. It's nice to be working. I've always been well-nigh unemployable. People don't want my deep topographic skills. They don't serve any kind of economic function. Nothing's generated from them. You know, you're not going to get some kind of glossy magazine focusing on my work, or, you know, I don't know. Sometimes I feel it's all been a colossal waste of time, actually. I feel that when I should have been sort of raising a family and earning, I've just been staring at scratch marks on pieces of concrete and getting the same views again and again and again and taking them in until I know them by heart. Wandering around streets for years on end, serving no purpose whatsoever. It's all going to get swept away anyway.
I don't think, you know, if you gave Nick a load of money, he'd just buy a nicer coat or a nicer notepad or something. Probably not a nicer one, just maybe two. So I think whatever happens, he'll be doing that.
I don't think Nick's immune to, I mean, obviously this film is being made, so it's a sort of paradoxical thing to say, oh, he cares nothing for the wider world. I mean, in a way he does, and he's, but I think he only cares about it in a very limited sense. I think he'd like to be acknowledged in as much as he wants Mogden purification works to be acknowledged. You know, I think he wants 21st century urban dwellers to see what's on the end of their fork, for whatever reason in that way. It's a kind of naked lunch of place.
Sidewalks and streets where once there were fields. But due to the incredibly rapid expansion, most cities outdistanced their planners when there were any, and grew into a maze of complexity and confusion. If we plan well, the trend is away from the congested center. This is the profile of a city, any city. Because of this lack of disciplined planning, many
I'm coiling now from the long sleep, and it spreads to where a motorbike cuts along the flyover, up into the outliers, over to suburbs still unexamined. I stride off across the bypass, up the dirty lane and through to the old isolation hospital. Asbestos slats give onto tussocks cracking in cold air and mildewed sacks on piles of broken bricks. You once stood over these dying moments and watched discharged patients chew wagon wheels while my raincoat flapped in the damp air. It is deep night now and I cannot anticipate my next move. The bus passes, its lights off, its seats empty. As the triangular park empties and shop blinds rattle down, a clotted gurgle announces our world. Now the day's adverbs and meals shift to silences more steeply than the minutes allow. In frozen weeks and summers full, here at a blackened shed where Lucy took James, 1968, discharge to banks of ivy, while periwinkles ignite to the clang of car doors slammed in my swollen face. I mean, it just seems to me that the suburbs are just a momentary dream of a mushroom god. We have sort of streets and houses. They'll all be blown away. Something will happen. But it will take a really cataclysmic event to change the shape of the land at any speed. And I'm not saying that couldn't happen, but it might do. I find suburbia eerie and very beautiful. I find it a painful place. So many people have lived their lives here, their sheds have rotted, their cats have died, the car's rusted, the cans of paint have dried out, the wife's grown a beard, you know, and then it's all gone and someone else moves in. Rich pickings for the deep topographer. And yet at the same time it's just a transitional thing. You know, it depends on the time scale you're looking at it with. It's either a huge storage vat of regional memory, or else it's just a momentary film. A suggestion of a possibility that will be replaced by other possibilities in due course.
But my sense of his own journey is that it has no limit. You know, I mean, if you talk to Nick, he wants to walk across Russia. You know, because he spent this time teaching in Gdansk and living in Poland. He speaks Polish, and he has this kind of Eastern European drift in his sensibility towards Central Europe. He is, of course, from a fairly polyglot background himself, and I think he's much more like Rambo in that way, more than any of the people who are kind of loosely involved in this practice that I know. I mean, I think he just wants to keep going in a way, and I think he probably will.
In 1930, to replace the urban district council sewage plants. Felt as if I'd unlocked a secret and civic or municipal analog.
You're in a house though?
That's right. I go to Malt Purification Works down there on the right hand side. I like it there.
I come and stand at every door. No one hears my silent tread. I knock and yet remain unseen, for I am dead. For I am dead. I'm only 7. Although I died in Hiroshima long ago, I'm 7 as I was then.
So I think everything is in the process of being turned inside out at the moment. And if Nick in the future wants to walk into the edgelands, he'll have to walk in as well as out, because I think the inside is going to be equally as strange and alienated as those fringes have always been.
How are they ever going to sell all those things they've got in John Lewis's? I sometimes think they can't sell they're going to sell all these spoons, all these chairs, all these pillowcases. I don't think the world's going to last long enough. I think there's going to be just ashes and spoons and pillowcases. People like Nick wandering through it, going, "Ooh, look at that, it's a diary here."
So I'd like my work to be found in a skip in Southgate or somewhere in 40 years' time.